بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم. اللهم ربنا أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم أرنا حقائق الأشياء كما هي ربنا زدنا علما وعملا وإخلاصا يا رب العالمين. اللهم ربنا أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم أرنا حقائق الأشياء كما هي ربنا زدنا علما وعملا وإخلاصا يا رب العالمين. اللهم انصر أولياءك في مشارق الأرض ومغاربها. اللهم انصرهم على عدوك وعدوهم إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم ألف بين قلوبهم وأصلح ذات بينهم. اللهم سدد رميهم وسدد خطاهم وسدد رأيهم. اللهم فرج عنا وعن إخواننا في مشارق الأرض ومغاربها. اللهم نفس كربنا وكربهم وثبت أقدامنا وأقدامهم والطف بنا وبهم يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم ربنا تقبل شهداءنا وارحم موتانا وموتى المسلمين. اللهم اغفر شهدانا وارحم شهدانا. اللهم فك أسرانا. اللهم اشف جرحانا ومرضانا. اللهم اصلح كل فاسد من أمور المسلمين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. وصل وسلم على سيدنا مولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم عليه وصل عليه. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. آمين آمين يا رب العالمين. Okay, so this is a question about how to evaluate and compare different paradigms or worldviews. The paradigm is a much limited concept. I think the question really is about worldviews, although the questioner hasn't used the word worldview. So we know how to evaluate statements within individual statements within a paradigm or within a context. But we probably don't know how to evaluate a paradigm itself, depending on we agree on what we mean by paradigm and or the context itself. And this is not the question. I think ultimately the question also boils down to statements, because if you are holistic, if you believe in holism, like coin, for example, because coin, I think if I remember him correctly, claims that you can't evaluate even a single statement without evaluating all the other statements which are related to it or which are presupposed by this statement. So that's a similar sort of problem. The problem of holism, the problem of holism, contextualism, paradigms, and worldviews. Similar sort of problems. And that's why people who reject these conceptions, their argument is that these concepts smack of relativism of various forms. Various forms. In the sense that people who talk in these terms, I think that ultimately we can't compare paradigms. We can't prioritize our own paradigm over any other paradigm. At most, what we can see is that that is our paradigm, that is our worldview, that is our context, that's how we are. So ultimately, it's based on your belief system, taking for granted assumptions, what we call imaniyat, which can't be justified because our justifications, in a sense, presuppose those paradigms or those imaniyat or those worldviews. So or those contexts. So this is basically I'm setting up a question. So that's the question, and it's one of the ongoing debates in philosophy between contextualist and non-contextualist. Or objectivist. And like other ultimate philosophical debate, they can't have any final answer, but we can give our own view and what makes sense to us. Okay, so we are going to try to answer this question in an obviously tentative way. Okay, so I think one distinction, conceptual distinction we should make at the start, I guess, is between two types of justification. And justification include evaluation, I guess. First one I will call just arbitrarily just normal justification. The other one, final or ultimate justification. Personally, I believe that it's possible to provide, just normal justification for your worldview. But that justification doesn't convince everybody, doesn't it's not decisive. On the other hand, final or ultimate justification. So just because you believe that ultimately, we start from a context, ultimately we start from taking for granted assumptions, it doesn't mean that we can't justify those assumptions. But probably what we mean when we say that we can't justify those justification, what we mean is we can't provide a final justification after which there won't be, everybody would be convinced and there won't be any further doubts about the veracity of our worldview or paradigm. So that's a sort of preemptive answer to those who think that saying that every theory a set of statement is based in the context of or taken for granted assumptions doesn't mean that we believe in those assumptions without any evidence. But what it means is that there's no decisive or final or ultimate justification of the thought 2 plus 2 4, for example. Okay, so that's one thing. Now I'm going to sort of speculate about how we can, in what ways we can evaluate a paradigm or a set of propositions. One way is through immanent critique. And by critique, we mean evaluation and other things as well. And a form of immanent critique can be internal critique. So I can evaluate my own worldview, for example, through distancing myself not entirely, but to a certain extent from my taken for granted assumptions. And this is possible because of the power of reflection. And the power of reflection is based on our ability to distance ourselves from our own um, convictions. So I can claim something, and I'm quite attached to that claim, but through distancing, if I'm successful, I can make my own claim into the object of my reflection. So this is second degree or meta level thinking. So we're thinking, my own claims become the object of my thinking and my reflection. So, for example, although I cannot step outside my worldview, and for this purpose, I'm using all these terms synonymously without defining really. Outside my own worldview, so it's impossible for me to entirely step outside my worldview unless I abandon it and lose faith in it. That's something else. But then the critique won't be internal critique. Okay, so although I can't step entirely outside, but I can step outside certain proposition or certain aspects of my worldview, and can, for example, reflect on certain part of my worldview through um, bracketing certain other part of my worldview, but I'm still within the overall ambit of my worldview. So, in that sense, it's an image. So I can assess certain by isolating certain proposition, maybe even taking for granted assumptions and making them into object of my thinking, while still, staying within the context of my overall worldview. I can assess certain taken for granted assumptions. And once those taken for granted assumptions, for example, become part of my reflection or become object of my reflection, they are no longer taken for granted assumption. They become object of my. Um, so this way, we can, in a piecemeal fashion, we can assess certain aspects of our taken for granted assumption or worldview or paradigms, while still, uh, on the whole, still staying within our own paradigm. So that's one way to evaluate certain aspects of our paradigm while staying within our paradigm, for example. Another way, which was mentioned in the question as well, another way to evaluate our paradigm or worldview is through its internal consistency, meaning that, and that internal consistency, obviously, consistency is more broader term than, for example, a lack of internal contradictions, for example. Um, so this internal consistency can be at two levels. So, for example, are taking for granted assumptions are internally consistent. That is, our belief system is internally consistent. Second level is the statements are empirical and other statements generated through or in the context of those taken for granted assumptions about the world, about ourselves, about others, etc., are also internally consistent. And they are more importantly, they are consistent with the worldview through which they are generated. And I would say the third thing is second sense in which a worldview or a paradigm is evaluated continuously is through what I would call reality test. Now, this test is not decisive for reasons I might mention as we go along, but any worldview obviously operate in the context of the real world, which include social world, cosmic reality, natural world, animal world, so cultural world, historically as well as horizontally. And that reality is testing our worldviews. And the worldview which cannot cope with the reality disintegrate or create or generate internal incoherence, or they lose the conviction in its basic taken for granted assumptions, for example. Although it is, there's a large gap between what, because there's always a gap between our thinking and our reality. Uh, it's never decisive. So, for example, a single statement can be decisively proven or refuted. For example, if you say that this wall can be penetrated by just running through it, that can be easily. If you run and uh, you know break your head, that statement would be refuted at once and probably decisively. But worldviews are more than that, because worldview can allow internal inconsistencies to a certain extent. They can allow uh, reality failures, because reality doesn't decisively reject or decisively refute uh, holistic statements or contexts or paradigms or worldviews as compared to uh, single statements. So, two paradigms, for example, for a long time can equally pass the test of reality, even though they are based on totally different and mutually exclusive assumption. For example, Ptolemy's or Ptolemaic paradigm about cosmology, at the practical level for a long time, it was, sufficient. It was able to guide people uh, through their navigation in the ocean and in the world as successfully as you know uh, the paradigm which succeeded it was able to do it. Maybe today it can't because of the other changes which has occurred in our technology and thing. But for a long time, just because Ptolemy's paradigm was eventually false, did not lead it to generate false statements about the world necessarily. So that's why Ptolemy's paradigm, as well as post-Ptolemy paradigm, to a certain extent, can coexist and pass the test of reality to equal degree for a long time. So that's why we can't always judge the superiority of a paradigm uh, just because it passed the test of reality, for example. Another example of this is Newton's physics versus Einstein's relativity theory, for example. Strictly speaking, Newtonian paradigm is false. Now, Einstein's paradigm is, truer than or more correct than Newton's paradigm. But for all practical purpose for our daily life, we can just assume that Newton's paradigm is true. So just um, at our ordinary level of experience, reality proves both these paradigms, almost equally true. Obviously, when we consider the special cases when Newton paradigm fails, then we know that Einstein's paradigm is superior to Newton's paradigm because it cannot pass certain tests of reality, etc. But it took us a long time to realize that. So this we are talking about just local physical paradigm. But if we talk about the worldview, which includes your view of your basic assumption about how the world works, how human beings are, their relation, etc., which includes basically everything, then a lot of different worldview can actually pass the test of reality. Um, and in my view, that ultimate justification will only be possible when we transcend this world, because within this world there can't be any decisive reality test for worldviews, for example. I mean, certain worldviews might be so, um, obviously wrong that they will ultimately fail the test of reality, even in this world. But we will still have enough number of paradigms, enough number of worldviews uh, left, of which we probably will never find decisive result from reality tests in this world, for example. So reality test is another way a paradigm can be evaluated, although not decisively. And another thing is, I think a paradigm or a worldview always faces a test from other paradigms and their believers. So there are objections from other believers in other paradigms and worldviews. And if you can't stand those objections or explain those objections or come up with solution to those objections, then your paradigm is weakened and you're taken for granted assumptions, and they grip on you, and your the people who believe in those assumptions loosen. And it is possible that through this process, certain paradigm will lose, you know, this battle of competition between not, for eternity, but for time being, maybe. So, so these are a few ways in which paradigms can be evaluated, but I don't believe that you can evaluate most of the paradigms and compare them and prove their superiority over others decisively in this world, especially when we move from paradigm to worldviews, etc. Okay, let's stop here. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك وصلي وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم عليه. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين آمين آمين يا رب العالمين.